It was a dark, fog-choked night in London, the streets eerily silent under the weight of the mist. Inside his cluttered office, Hercule Poirot sat in quiet contemplation, his sharp eyes reflecting the steady tick of the clock. But then, the peace was shattered. The door swung open with a force that rattled the hinges, and a young woman, wild-eyed and disheveled, stumbled in, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was pale, trembling, as if the very air she breathed was suffocating her. "I think I've committed a crime," she whispered, voice trembling with a terror that was palpable. "But I can't remember doing it. I don't know what happened. All I know is that here is blood on my hand sand. I can't remember how it got there." Her words struck like a thunderclap, and Poirot's mind instantly snapped into focus. Who was this woman, and what unspeakable act had she somehow erased from her memory? Norma Restarick, a young woman seemingly caught in the grip of her own fractured past, was now thrust into a mystery that threatened to consume her. But Poirot knew that the mind can play cruel tricks, and sometimes the darkest secrets are buried so deep, even the victim cannot recall the horror they've lived. Was she guilty, or was there a far more sinister force at play? With no memory of the crime she feared, Poirot could only wonder. Or what had manipulated her mind? And to what end? One thing was certain. This case was far from what it seemed. The fog of confusion was just the beginning. What lay ahead would reveal a far darker truth, and Poirot would stop at nothing to uncover it. The game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Relatable characters. Hercule Poirot. The Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, was a man of contradictions. To those who encountered him for the first time, he might have seemed nothing more than a slightly eccentric, even fussy little man, his perfectly groomed mustache twitching as he adjusted his tie or straightened his hat. His polished shoes clicked against the floor with a rhythm that suggested a quiet sense of pride in his every step. His accent, charmingly French, rolled off his tongue with precise articulation, and his manners were impeccable. Yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly unassuming figure lay a mind sharper than a surgeon's scalpel, slicing through the complexities of the human psyche with unnerving precision. In every encounter, Poirot was a master of reading people. Where others saw only the obvious, he saw beneath the surface the hidden fears, the subtle tells that betrayed a person's true nature. His mind was an intricate machine, effortlessly connecting dots that others would never even notice. He observed not only the actions of those around him, but also their thoughts, their motivations, their insecurities. And while he carried the aura of charm, there was a relentless, almost obsessive quality to his intellect that allowed him to solve cases others had long abandoned. But Poirot's charm was not just in his mind. It was in his ability to connect with people. He understood their weaknesses and their desires, and could, at times, make them feel as though they had no choice but to tell him everything. His methods were always precise, and although he often appeared calm and composed, the intensity of his focus was unparalleled. Those who had worked with him through both victory and failure had learned to respect the quiet storm that always raged just beneath his calm exterior. At times, Poirot's reputation as a gentleman detective had worked in his favor. His polished manner and calm demeanor often disarmed even the most hardened criminals, allowing him to get to the heart of a mystery. But the deeper he dove into the case of Norma Restarick, the more he found himself questioning his own assumptions. There was something about her raw darkness hidden just beneath her fragile exterior that stirred something in Poirot, something familiar. Norma Restarick. Norma Restarick was no stranger to suffering. Her beauty, which once captivated the eyes of men and women alike, now seemed almost like a mask, concealing the deep well of fear and uncertainty that lurked behind her pale blue eyes. She was tall, with long dark hair that framed her face like a waterfall of ink, but it was her eyes, those eyes, that betrayed the turmoil inside her. They flickered with a kind of wild, haunted energy, as if her very soul had been touched by something unspeakable. And yet, there was something about her, something innocent, almost childlike, that drew people in. Norma had spent much of her life in the shadow of her overbearing mother, Mrs. Restarick, a woman whose coldness could freeze the air in a room. From an early age, Norma had been taught to hide her emotions, to bury her fears and desires deep within. The Restarick name was one of distinction, a name that carried the weight of old money and even older secrets. Norma had been raised with every luxury one could imagine, but also with the suffocating expectation of perfection. Her mother had made it clear that Norma was to be flawless in every regard, from her mannerisms to her appearance, to her very thoughts. But no one could ever be flawless, least of all Norma. At the heart of her pain was a memoria, rather, the absence of one. There were gaps in her life that Norma could never quite fill. There were nights when the fog in her mind grew too thick, and she couldn't tell if the fragments of her past were real or just the result of her own imagination. Her dreams were often filled with shadows' voices whispering in her ear, figures lurking just out of sight. Sometimes she would wake with a scream on her lips, her body drenched in sweat, but the memory of the nightmare would vanish as quickly as it had come. All she could remember was a cold, unshakable fear, and the overwhelming sense that something terrible had happened, something she had done or was going to do. Norma had always been somewhat of an enigma, even to those closest to her. Her fiancé, Hugh Chandler, was the only person who seemed to understand her, or at least, the only one who claimed to. Their relationship had been one of passionate highs and devastating lows. Hugh, a handsome young man with an air of calm and assurance, was everything Norma seemed to need. Protective, gentle, and steady. But as much as she loved him, Norma couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she didn't know about him, some part of him that he kept hidden away. She had asked him time and time again about his past, about the people he had known before her, but each time he would smile and change the subject, as if she had never spoken at all. And then there was the strange case of Clara. Norma's mind recoiled whenever she thought of Clara. Clara, who had lived with her and her two other roommates in the cramped apartment, seemed like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Where Norma was haunted by gaps in her memory, Clara was an enigma in and of herself. She had a way of making everyone around her uncomfortable, her too bright smile and over-the-top enthusiasm masking something darker, something almost sinister. Clara's presence always seemed to stir trouble, and yet she had a way of making others believe that she was the victim, the one who had been wrong. But as Norma began to dig into Clara's past, she realized that Clara's life was far more tangled and dangerous than she had ever imagined. One morning, Clara was gone. Just disappeared. No trace, no goodbye. No one spoke of her again, but Norma's mind wouldn't let it go. There was something about that disappearance that didn't sit right with her. It was as if Clara had been swallowed up by the shadows, erased from the world entirely. And now, here she was, Norma sitting in the dim office of Hercule Poirot, desperate and afraid, believing that she had done something terrible, something unspeakable, but unable to remember a single detail. The blood on her hands, the nightmares, the missing pieces of her life, they all seemed to point in the same direction, a truth too horrible to face. Norma didn't know if she was guilty of something she couldn't recall, or if someone else had framed her. But whatever the answer was, she knew that finding the truth was the only way to escape the chains of fear that bound her. And Hercule Poirot, the brilliant Belgian detective, was the only one who could help her unravel the mystery of her own life. Hugh Chandler, Norma's fiancé. Hugh Chandler was a man who could command a room with just a look. Tall, with broad shoulders and a presence that made everyone around him instinctively feel protected, he had a calm, almost serene quality to him. He spoke in a measured tone, always polite, always well-mannered. His dark hair, neatly combed, and his sharp, striking features made him the sort of man that women often whispered about when he passed. He was the embodiment of steadiness, the perfect gentleman who could be trusted without question. To the outside world, Hugh was a man of unwavering devotion to Norma. He had proposed to her with a tenderness that made her feel like the most precious thing on earth. Every look he gave her seemed to be laden with care, and his touch was always gentle, always reassuring. It was as if he could see her fragility and wanted to protect her from the world, from herself. His love for Norma was palpable, and it seemed to be the one thing in her life that never wavered. But to Poirot, nothing was ever as it seemed. The facade Hugh wore was flawless, but Poirot's keen eye caught the subtle cracks, the fleeting moments when the mask slipped. The way Hugh would hesitate before answering certain questions, the tightness in his jaw whenever Norma's past was brought up, the quick, almost imperceptible glance he would give to her mother, Mrs. Restarick. It all raised questions in Poirot's mind, questions that needed to be answered. There were times when Poirot wondered if Hugh's love for Norma was genuine or if it was a carefully crafted performance to keep her within his control. His devotion seemed almost obsessive at times. He never let her out of his sight for long, and whenever the subject of Clara came up, Hugh would quickly change the topic or offer an excuse to leave the room. Norma's mother, Mrs. Restarick, never seemed to approve of their relationship, and that disapproval only made Hugh more protective. Was it genuine love, or was Hugh hiding something darker, something he wasn't ready to reveal? Poirot knew that in order to uncover the truth, he would have to delve deeper into Hugh Chandler's past. There were cracks in his polished exterior, and Poirot was determined to find out what lay beneath. The question was, how far would Hugh go to protect the woman he loved? Or was there something even more sinister at play? Mrs. Restarick, Norma's mother, Mrs. Restarick was a woman who commanded respect with every word she spoke. Tall and statuesque, she carried herself with an air of superiority, as though she were constantly aware of her own importance. Her sharp features were framed by elegantly styled gray hair, and her piercing blue eyes held an intensity that made even the most confident of men uneasy. She had an unspoken power about her, power that wasn't born from physical strength, but from a deep, unsettling authority that could bend others to her will. She had raised Norma with strict discipline, teaching her to be the perfect daughter in every way, poised, well-spoken, and obedient. There was no room for weakness in Mrs. Restarick's world, no room for imperfection. Everything had to be done according to her meticulous standards. She often referred to herself as the matriarch, a title that she believed was deserved by virtue of her family's long history of wealth and respectability. Her connections were numerous, her influence vast, and she wore her social status like a crown. Yet, there was always something cold about her, a chill that made her more feared than loved. Her relationship with Norma was strained, to say the least. Mrs. Restarick had always expected perfection from her daughter, and Norma had never been able to live up to those expectations. Mrs. Restarick never hesitated to remind Norma of her perceived shortcomings, often telling her that she could do better, be better. There was little warmth in their interactions, and Norma had long since learned to bury any desire for affection or approval from her mother. But Mrs. Restarick's influence on the family went beyond just Norma. There were whispers, quiet murmurs in the halls of the Restarick estate, that she held secrets about their family's past, secrets that she had taken great care to bury. It was said that Mrs. Restarick had once been involved in a scandalous affair that threatened to ruin the family's reputation, but the details were never fully known. Some said it was the reason she had been so strict with Normato, prevent her daughter from making the same mistakes. Others speculated that Mrs. Restarick had orchestrated the affair to her own advantage, using it to further her own ambitions. Poirot had quickly noted Mrs. Restarick's cold demeanor when he spoke to her. She gave nothing away, her words carefully chosen, her expressions guarded. Yet, Poirot could sense that she was hiding something important, and he knew that in order to unravel the mystery of Norma's past, he would have to peel back the layers of Mrs. Restarick's carefully constructed facade. What was she hiding? And more importantly, how far would she go to protect those secrets? The deeper Poirot delved into her life, the more he suspected that Mrs. Restarick's role in this tangled web was far more significant than anyone could have imagined. Ethel Simmons, the housekeeper. Ethel Simmons had worked for the Restarick family for as long as anyone could remember, and in all that time she had never once stepped out of line. She was a quiet woman, with soft features that made her appear much younger than her years. Her eyes were a dull brown, almost too tired to see clearly, and her voice was soft, almost whispering, as if she feared disturbing the peace. Ethel was the kind of person who seemed to blend into the background, unnoticed by most. She did her work quietly, without complaint, and rarely ever spoke of anything outside the duties of her job. Yet there was something about her that made Poirot uneasy. She was always watching, always listening. No matter where he went in the Restarick household, he could feel her presence, a quiet observer who knew far more than she let on. Ethel's stoic demeanor hid a mind that was constantly at work, piecing together the fragments of information she gleaned from her years of service. She had seen it all: the arguments between Mrs. Restarick and Norma, the whispered conversations between Hugh Chandler and his fiancée, the strange comings and goings of the household. Ethel was the one who knew all the secrets, yet never said a word. What made Ethel even more intriguing was the way she seemed to react to the disappearance of Clara. Where everyone else had tried to move on, Ethel remained distant, her face blank whenever the topic came up. It was as though Clara's absence had disturbed her in ways she couldn't quite explain. Poirot had noted that more than once he had caught Ethel staring out the window at nothing, her thoughts drifting off into places he could not follow. But there was more to Ethel Simmons than met the eye. She had seen the undercurrents of the Restarick family's dynamic for years, and she understood the complex relationships better than anyone else. What did she know about Norma's past? What did she know about the mysterious Clara? Ethel might have been quiet, but Poirot knew that she held the key to unlocking the final pieces of the puzzle. All it took was the right question, the right moment, and Ethel would reveal the truth. Twists and turns. Poirot had seen it all before: the hidden motives, the carefully constructed lies, the people who would stop at nothing to conceal the truth. But as he stepped into the dimly lit apartment on the edge of London, the scene before him held an eerie weight. The space felt like it had been frozen in time. Each piece of furniture, each photograph, held a quiet testimony to the lives that had once inhabited it. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that Poirot had imagined would await him. No signs of struggle. No broken objects, just a palpable silence. His eyes swept the room as he took in the details, his mind working at lightning speed, cataloging everything. He could see that Norma Restarick had lived here with two other women who, judging by the personal effects scattered about, had once been an integral part of her life. But there was something strange about the place. A quiet tension lingered in the air, like a secret that had been buried and was now slowly resurfacing. Poirot's gaze settled on the worn armchair near the window. The fabric was faded, the cushion slightly sunken, as though it had been sat in often. He stepped closer and noticed the faint smell of perfume in the air, delicate, floral, but now tinged with the unmistakable scent of something heavier, something deeper. His fingers grazed the fabric, and then he froze, his eyes narrowing as he spotted an old letter, half hidden beneath the chair's edge. It was an odd thing to find in the middle of a missing persons case, but Poirot knew better than to dismiss anything that seemed out of place. He carefully picked up the letter, unfolding it with precision. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were sharp and telling. To Clara, do not forget, you are still ours. This is not over. The message sent a chill down Poirot's spine. It wasn't just an ordinary letter, it was a threat, and if Norma had been living with Clara, someone else might have been involved in whatever had led to the young woman's disappearance. Poirot carefully folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket, then turned his attention to the two other women who had shared the apartment with Norma. He knew their names, Clara and Eleanor, but he needed to understand who they were beneath the surface. Clara, in particular, was a mystery. Norma's memory loss, a manipulated reality. As Poirot continued his investigation, He found himself growing more intrigued by the shadowy figure of Clara. The letter was just one piece of the puzzle, but it painted a clear picture of someone who wasn't simply missing, they had been forced out of the narrative, erased from the lives of those who knew them. Poirot's first conversation with Norma had been troubling. The young woman was barely holding herself together, her fingers shaking as she spoke. She kept saying the same things over and over again, as if trying to convince herself of her innocence, of her ignorance of events that seemed to haunt her. "I don't know what happened that night," Norma had confessed. "I don't remember. It's all a blur. But I am not crazy, Poirot. Someone's trying to frame me. I swear." Norma's words echoed in Poirot's mind as he pored over every detail of the case. There was no clear evidence to suggest that she had committed a crime, but her mind was a locked vault, each memory sealed tight. Poirot could not ignore the possibility that her memory loss wasn't just an unfortunate accident. Was it possible that someone close to her had carefully manipulated her into forgetting what she had witnessed, what she had known? Was her mind a weapon, one that had been turned against her? The more Poirot thought about it, the clearer the connection became. He knew about the psychological tactics people use to manipulate others, especially those who were vulnerable. Drugs, hypnosis, even suggestion, these were all methods that could have been employed to wipe out fragments of memory, to bend reality to someone else's will. And the more he thought about Norma, the more it seemed as if she was a victim in a larger game, one that she hadn't even realized she was playing. The question of memory and manipulation. Poirot had seen enough in his time to recognize the signs. Memory loss, when sudden and unexplainable, was often a tool used by those with darker motives. And in this case, the manipulation seemed personal. Norma had been living in that apartment with Clara and Eleanor, two women with troubled pasts of their own. But it was Clara who caught Poirot's attention. He spent the next few days retracing Norma's steps, speaking to those who had known the women. He learned that Clara was not just missing, she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some said she had run away, others claimed that she had been involved in something far more sinister, something that had put her life in danger. But no one seemed to know where she had gone or why she had left. Eleanor, the other woman in the apartment, was evasive when Poirot questioned her. She claimed to know little about Clara's disappearance, but Poirot could tell that there was something she wasn't saying. The tension between the two women had been palpable, and Eleanor's nervousness spoke volumes. Clara. She was always a bit unpredictable, Eleanor had said, her eyes darting to the door as though she expected someone to walk in at any moment. But I never thought she'd just leave like that. Poirot had pressed her further, but Eleanor was tight-lipped, unwilling to divulge any more. And yet, Poirot couldn't help but feel that there was a connection between Clara's disappearance and Norma's fragmented memories. The timing was too perfect. Clara had vanished, and Norma had been left behind, with nothing but a memory that seemed to fade with every passing day. A poisoned legacy. As Poirot dug deeper, he uncovered another chilling detail. Norma had been drugged. A small dose of a potent sedative had been introduced into her system at regular intervals. It was subtle, undetectable at first, but the effects were clear. The drugs had clouded her mind, erasing crucial moments of her memory. Who had done this, and why? Poirot was certain that whoever had been behind this scheme was someone with knowledge of psychology, someone who understood the intricacies of the human mind. They knew how to break a person down, how to manipulate their memories until they could no longer trust their own perceptions of reality. As Poirot continued to connect the dots, it became clear that Norma had been the target of a well-crafted plan. The drugs had been introduced gradually, and the ultimate goal was to make her believe she had committed a crime she had no memory of. But why? What had she seen? What had she been part of? And who was behind it? The deeper Poirot delved into the mystery, the more sinister it became. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture was one he didn't want to see. The conspiracy went far beyond Norma's memory loss, and the true mastermind had yet to reveal themselves. But Poirot was relentless. He would find the truth, no matter how twisted it had become, and when he did, he would make sure justice was served, no matter the cost. Clara's dangerous affair. Poirot stood in the middle of the apartment, his gaze sharp as he examined the quiet space once shared by Norma and her two roommates. The apartment, though neat, whispered of a time gone by, a time when Norma had been surrounded by people whose lives were now entangled in a mystery so thick that even the brilliant detective struggled to untangle it. He had already uncovered one troubling aspect, Norma's memory loss, which he was beginning to suspect was far from accidental. But there was something else, something even more disquieting, pulling at his thoughts. Clara's missing woman. Clara, who had been part of the tight-knit group in this apartment, yet had seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. As Poirot turned to leave, a thought struck him. Clara's disappearance was more than just an oddity, it was the central piece of the puzzle. And if Norma's memory had been carefully manipulated, if she had been drugged and rendered vulnerable, then surely Clara's disappearance wasn't random. Someone had been involved, and that someone had a motive. Clara's affair. A dangerous connection. Poirot's investigation had taken him down numerous avenues. He'd spoken to neighbors, friends, and anyone else who might know something about the lives of the three women. But it wasn't until he spoke with Eleanor that the true nature of Clara's life came into focus. Eleanor had been cautious at first, reluctant to speak about Clara's personal life. But Poirot's sharp intuition and steady questioning began to break down her defenses. Slowly, Eleanor revealed something that chilled Poirot to the core. "Clara, she wasn't like the rest of us," Eleanor had said, her voice lower now, a nervous edge creeping into her tone. "She always seemed restless, always looking over her shoulder, like she was waiting for something or someone to catch up with her. But it wasn't until she started seeing him that's when everything changed." Poirot's ears perked up. A relationship? An affair? His mind clicked into action as he pressed her for more details. "The man she was seeing," Eleanor continued, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening, "wasn't just anyone. He was powerful, influential. He had connections that could destroy people if he wanted to. I think she was in over her head, Poirot, and I am just sure he was involved in her disappearance." The man behind the curtain, Poirot, ever the observant detective, connected the dots in his mind. Clara had been involved with someone dangerous, someone with the power to pull strings behind the scenes. But who was he, and what had Clara gotten herself tangled in? Eleanor described him as a man who had come into Clara's life quietly, but with increasing force. A wealthy businessman, one whose name was known in London's high society circles. A man who owned several properties, whose family had ties to politics, and whose name was often whispered in the corridors of power. His identity was kept close to the chest, but Eleanor had seen the way Clara's demeanor shifted when she spoke of him. There was fear, mixed with something else, an undeniable sense of dependency. Poirot wasn't surprised by this revelation. It was common for people to find themselves caught in webs of power and influence, unaware of the trap they were stepping into. But Clara's case was different. This man wasn't just a wealthy businessman or a high-profile socialite. He had ties to people who didn't hesitate to take extreme measures to protect their secrets. The affair takes a dark turn. Eleanor, although reluctant, had a final piece of the puzzle to share something she had only recently learned. Clara's relationship with the mysterious man had taken a darker turn. There had been whispers about shady deals, promises made and broken, and perhaps even threats that Clara had received in the last few weeks before she vanished. Clara was scared, Poirot, Eleanor said, wringing her hands. She started receiving letters, threats. And then she began to act differently. She wasn't herself. She started talking about disappearing, going far away. And then, just like that, she was gone. Poirot's mind raced. A person like Clara, entangled in a dangerous affair with someone so influential, was not just a victim of love, she was a victim of circumstance, trapped in a web that was woven by the powerful forces she had foolishly become involved with. But what happened to Clara? Was she alive? Or had her life been snuffed out, a casualty of a dangerous game? Poirot's first instinct was to find the man involved, to learn his identity, and uncover the extent of his involvement. But as the investigation deepened, Poirot realized that Clara's disappearance was not just about Herod, was about something much larger. A network of power, greed, and secrets that stretched far beyond what Norma and Eleanor had known. Raising the stakes, alive or dead, Poirot couldn't help but wonder, was Clara still alive? Or had she paid the ultimate price for her involvement with a man too powerful to be touched by the law? He couldn't shake the feeling that Clara had known too much, had seen something she wasn't meant to see. If she were dead, the motive was clear, a silencing of a loose end. But if she were still alive, then the stakes were even higher. Someone was still out there, pulling strings, manipulating the narrative, and ensuring that the truth would never come to light. The uncertainty was maddening, and yet Poirot felt a strange sense of resolve. He would find Clara, no matter the cost. Whether she was alive or dead, she was the key to unlocking the rest of this tangled mystery. And with every passing moment, he knew the danger was growing for Norma, for those who were already involved, and for himself. As Poirot prepared to confront the man behind Clara's disappearance, he knew that the truth would be darker than he had imagined. But the detective was nothing if not relentless, and in the world of shadows and deceit, Poirot was the light that would cut through the darkness. The only question now was, could he uncover the truth before it was too late? Suspense and tension. A dangerous whip. The deeper Hercule Poirot delved into the case, the more entangled he became in a web of lies and deception, each thread pulling him further into the shadows. The faces around him, Norma, Hugh, Mrs. Restarick, even the quiet housekeeper Ethel Simmons, seemed to be hiding something. Each had a story, but each story felt incomplete, as though some critical part had been carefully obscured. Poirot's sharp eyes caught every detail, every subtle flicker of unease in their expressions, every shift in their voices. Norma's fractured memories, Hugh's overly protective demeanor, Mrs. Restarick's cold, calculating silence, and Ethel's quiet observation, each piece of the puzzle, hinted at a greater truth that nobody wanted him to see. The more he uncovered, the more it seemed that everyone involved in this tangled drama had something to hide. The threads of their secrets began to wrap around Poirot like a vice, squeezing tighter with each new revelation. Norma's trauma, Clara's disappearance, the strained family dynamics, everything pointed to a dark core, a truth that had been buried far too long. But what was that truth? Was it a crime, a conspiracy, or something even darker? The closer Poirot got to the answers, the more dangerous his path became. He knew it wasn't just a matter of finding out who had committed the crime. It was a matter of finding out why they had hidden it and what they would do to keep him from uncovering it. The tension builds. As Poirot's investigation progressed, strange things started to happen around him. It began with little signs, things out of place, faint echoes of whispered conversations when he wasn't supposed to be listening, shadows in the corners of rooms that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking. A sense of unease clung to him like a second skin. Someone was watching him, following his every move. Poirot, however, was no stranger to danger. He was the master of reading the subtlest cues, and what he sensed now was more than mere paranoia. There was a deliberate attempt to throw him off the trail. One evening, as Poirot sat in his office, a soft knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find a note, slipped hastily under the door. The handwriting was unsteady, frantic. "Leave the case alone. You don't know what you are getting into." There was no signature, no other clue to the sender's identity. Poirot read the message twice, his brow furrowing. The tension had escalated. Whoever had sent the note was well aware of his progress. They were willing to do whatever it took to stop him. As he walked the streets of London that night, the mist felt colder, thicker, as if it were closing in on him. The shadows seemed to stretch further, hiding dangers he could not yet see, but felt nonetheless. And then, The phone call. A voice on the other end of the line, distorted and cold. "Stop poking around, Poirot, or you'll regret it." The line went dead. The silence that followed was oppressive, suffocating. It was clear now. Someone was actively trying to sabotage his investigation, to steer him away from the truth. But Poirot wasn't one to be easily intimidated. He was used to being in dangerous, to navigating the shadows to uncover the light. The only thing that remained unclear was who, exactly, was pulling the strings. Was it Hugh Chandler, with his charming smiles and guarded demeanor? Or perhaps it was Mrs. Restarick, her icy facade hiding a mind capable of calculating the most devious plans. Or could it be someone else entirely, someone whose involvement had yet to surface? The first confrontation. Poirot's investigation brought him face to face with Hugh Chandler, Norma's devoted fiancé, in the quiet corner of a drawing room. Hugh's calm, composed demeanor had never faltered throughout the investigation, but Poirot had long suspected there was more to him than met the eye. "Hugh, my friend," Poirot began, his voice calm but firm, "I must ask you directly, what do you know of Clara's disappearance? And, more importantly, what do you know about the secrets that bind this family?" Hugh stiffened at the mention of Clara's name, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Poirot noted the reaction with sharp interest. It was the first crack in Hugh's polished exterior. "I have no idea what you mean," Hugh replied, his voice steady but tinged with an edge that didn't quite match his usual calm. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, but you do, Monsieur Chandler. You see, I've spoken to many people. I've heard stories of an affair, of a man with influence and power, a man who could make people disappear without anyone noticing. And I've heard your name more than once." Hugh's face darkened, and for a moment, Poirot saw a flicker of something: fear, guilt. It was gone too quickly to confirm, but it was there, unmistakable. "I don't know what you are talking about," Hugh repeated, though his voice now carried a tremor that betrayed his calm facade. "I love Norma. I am trying to protect her from all of this." "Protect her?" Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Or protect yourself? The question, my friend, is not just what you are protecting her from, but what you are protecting her for. Because I am starting to believe you are hiding something, and I intend to find out what." Hugh's eyes flashed, and for the briefest moment, Poirot saw a man on the edge, someone who had been hiding far too much, for far too long. But instead of confessing, Hugh's lips pressed into a tight line, and he stood, stepping away from the detective. "I have nothing more to say to you," Hugh said coldly, his voice now fully composed. Poirot watched as Hugh turned and walked out of the room, his back straight, his steps firm. But Poirot knew the truth. Hugh Chandler was hiding something that tied him irrevocably to the mystery. The confrontation had only raised more questions. Why had Hugh reacted so strongly? Was he involved with Clara's disappearance? Or was there something else he feared Poirot would uncover? As Poirot sat back in his chair, his mind was a whirlwind of possibilities. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. Whoever was behind this, they were getting desperate. And with every passing moment, Poirot was drawing closer to the truth. But the stakes were higher now. Hugh was no longer just a suspect. He was a man with something to protect. And Poirot knew that men with secrets were the most dangerous of all. Strong ending. Climactic moment. The fog that had clung to Poirot's investigation for weeks began to lift. The clues, once scattered and seemingly disconnected, now formed a picture so clear that it could no longer be ignored. Norma had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a game much larger and more dangerous than she had ever realized. Poirot sat in his office, reviewing the facts one last time. Every interaction, every subtle look, every word spoken by the key players suddenly, everything made sense. Norma had never been the criminal she believed herself to be. The truth was far more twisted, and the manipulator far closer than anyone had suspected. With a deep breath, Poirot finally stood and walked towards the door. The room felt colder now, the weight of what he had uncovered hanging heavy in the air. He knew exactly what he had to do next, the shocking truth. When Poirot confronted Mrs. Restarick, there was no anger in his voice, just quiet determination. He knew now that it was she who had masterminded the entire charade. Mrs. Restarick's cold exterior, the icy demeanor she had shown to her daughter, had always masked a dark, dangerous secret. "It was you, wasn't it?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, yet filled with an undeniable authority. "You orchestrated this entire situation, manipulated Norma into believing she had committed a crime she had no memory of. You made her forget the truth, because the truth would destroy you." Mrs. Restarick's face faltered for the first time, the mask slipping away to reveal the desperation beneath. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to do it. Norma was too weak. She couldn't know what really happened. She couldn't remember. The memory loss," Poirot continued, "wasn't an accident. It was planned. You drugged her, erased her mind, so she could never recall the terrible secret you had buried for so long." Mrs. Restarick's shoulders slumped as she realized there was no escaping the truth. "I never meant for things to go this far," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But Norma had to be protected from herself, from what she would uncover about our family. We were involved in something that could ruin us all." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind working quickly. The truth about Clara, about the affair, about the man with power who could have destroyed you. It all makes sense now. Mrs. Restarick nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Clara, she knew everything, and I couldn't let Norma find out. So, I did what I had to do to protect my family, even if it meant destroying my daughter's memory in the process." Poirot's final words. As Mrs. Restarick was taken away, Poirot turned to the quiet room, his thoughts a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. He had solved the case, yes, but at what cost? The truth had come to light, but the damage done to Norma, to her family, was irreversible. The simplest of clues had led him to this moment where the truth was uncovered, but it had left only ruin in its wake. Poirot knew that in every case he solved, he was uncovering not just the facts, but the hidden, often painful layers of the human soul. Some secrets, once revealed, could never be forgotten. He stood silently for a moment, contemplating the tangled mess of lies, love, and betrayal that had brought them to this point. Then, with a soft sigh, he spoke the words that would echo in the minds of those who had followed the investigation from the beginning. The simplest of clues can often reveal the most complex of truths, if one is only willing to look beyond the obvious. It was a lesson that, in the end, Norma would have to learn for herself. And as Poirot turned and left the room, he knew one thing for sure. No matter how many cases he solved, there would always be more mysteries, more secrets, more lives to untangle. But that, Poirot understood, was the price of truth. Cliffhanger. As Poirot stepped out into the cold London night, his mind still churning with the recent revelations, something caught his eye, a glint of light reflected off a thick envelope. He paused, raising an eyebrow as the small, unassuming letter was handed to him by a messenger who vanished into the shadows without a word. The seal, an intricate insignia Poirot did not recognize, sent a shiver down his spine. It was not just any letter. It was a message that promised to pull him back into the darkness of another unsolved mystery. Poirot broke the seal with practiced precision, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, his mind raced. "I know what happened to Clara. The story you were told is only part of the truth. There is more, far more, that lies beneath the surface. You must come if you wish to learn what happened to Herond, while your investigation has only just begun." A chill ran through Poirot's body as he finished reading. His logical mind screamed that he should let it go, that he had done enough, but the lure of the unknown, the pull of a new mystery, was far stronger. Poirot knew one thing with absolute certainty. The game was not over. Without a second thought, he slid the letter into his coat pocket, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He had always known that once he solved one case, another would come knocking one, that would be even more dangerous, more complex, more challenging. The thrill of the chase was a part of him, an inescapable force that kept him moving forward. Final words. The camera zooms out as Poirot walks into the misty night, the street lamps casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets. The voice of the narrator rises, a final note of suspense hanging in the air. The truth may be revealed, but the questions never end. For Hercule Poirot, each case is just the beginning of another mystery waiting to be unraveled. What lies ahead? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain: Poirot's journey is far from over. And as the screen fades to black, the audience is left on the edge of their seats, 1,000 questions swirling in their minds. What happened to Clara? Who is behind this new letter? And what other secrets lie waiting to be uncovered?